The birth certificate filed in Hennepin County, Minnesota, on March 7, 1965, listed parents who shared the same last name, the same grandparents, and a genetic legacy so twisted that the child born that day would challenge everything medical science understood about human survival. This is the story of how a family's century-long tradition of isolation and intermarriage created a bloodline so corrupted that its final offspring would become both medical miracle and living horror. The hollow echo of wind through abandoned mine shafts, the acrid smell of rusted iron mixed with decades of decay, the rough texture of weathered wooden signs warning visitors away from unstable ground. These were the sensations that greeted anyone brave enough to venture into the remote hills of southeastern Minnesota, where the Kensington family had made their home since 1849, hidden in a valley so isolated that mail delivery had been discontinued in 1923. The Kensington homestead represented one of America's last truly forgotten communities. The family's isolation hadn't been accidental. Jonas Kensington, the patriarch who'd established the homestead in 1849, had fled civilization after what court records from Pennsylvania described as unnatural relations with his own blood kin. He'd brought with him 3 daughters, 2 sons, and a fanatical belief that God intended certain bloodlines to remain pure through careful preservation of family traits across generations. What Jonas couldn't have foreseen was how his interpretation of genetic purity would evolve over the following century into something that would have horrified even his twisted sensibilities. By 1965, the Kensington family tree had become so entangled with itself that distinguishing between parent and child, sibling and spouse, had become virtually impossible for anyone trying to understand the relationships from the outside. The birth that occurred on March 7, 1965, represented the culmination of 4 generations of systematic inbreeding that had produced a child whose very existence challenged the boundaries of human biology. The infant, registered as Jonathan Kensington III, was born to parents who were simultaneously siblings, cousins, and uncle and niece, a genetic impossibility that shouldn't have been able to produce viable offspring. Some bloodlines poison themselves. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the traveling physician who attended the birth, documented what she witnessed in medical notes that would remain sealed in state archives for decades. The infant presents with developmental abnormalities consistent with severe inbreeding depression, including cranial malformation, limb deformities, and neurological symptoms that suggest extensive genetic damage. Most disturbing is the child's apparent consciousness, despite physical abnormalities that should have resulted in immediate death. The birth itself had been attended by only 3 people: Dr. Morrison, the child's mother, Sarah Kensington, and Sarah's father, brother, uncle Marcus, who served as both patriarch of the family and father of the newborn. The complex relationships within the Kensington household had evolved over generations of intermarriage into arrangements that defied conventional understanding of family structure. Sarah Kensington, age 19 at the time of the birth, had herself been born to parents who were first cousins and half-siblings. Her relationship with Marcus represented the continuation of a family tradition that viewed marriage outside the bloodline as corruption of their genetic heritage. By 1965, the Kensington family consisted of 12 people living in 4 interconnected cabins, all related through multiple overlapping bloodlines that had been carefully maintained for over a century. The medical implications of this systematic inbreeding were evident throughout the family. Dr. Sex Morrison's notes describe a household where genetic abnormalities were so common that they were considered normal variations rather than medical conditions. Several family members exhibited signs of severe developmental disabilities, while others displayed physical deformities that had been passed down and amplified through generations of intermarriage. What made Jonathan's birth particularly significant wasn't just the severity of his genetic abnormalities. It was his family's determination to present him to the outside world as evidence of their genetic superiority rather than its obvious failure. Marcus Kensington had spent months preparing for the birth, corresponding with medical researchers and government officials about what he called his family's genetic achievement. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story has already disturbed you, hit that like button and subscribe, because the truth about what the Kensington family did to maintain their bloodline makes this introduction look tame by comparison. The correspondence between Marcus and various medical institutions reveals a man who genuinely believed that his family's century of isolation had produced genetic improvements rather than the obvious deterioration that any trained observer could see. His letters to the University of Minnesota Medical School, dated throughout 1964 and early 1965, describe Jonathan's expected birth as the culmination of careful breeding practices that have preserved and concentrated the finest qualities of our ancestral line. But Marcus's confidence in his family's genetic superiority would soon be tested by medical professionals who understood the true implications of systematic inbreeding. Dr. Nind. Morrison's decision to document the birth and report her findings to state health authorities would trigger an investigation that would expose not just the Kensington family's genetic tragedy, but the broader conspiracy of silence that had allowed their isolated community to operate without oversight for over a century. The question that would haunt investigators was whether the Kensington family's genetic experimentation represented an isolated case of backwoods ignorance, or whether their systematic approach to bloodline preservation indicated knowledge and planning that suggested more sinister motivations. As word of Jonathan's birth began to spread through medical and academic circles, experts would discover that the Kensington family's isolation hadn't been as complete as they'd claimed, and that their genetic experiments had attracted the attention of researchers whose interest in human heredity would prove far more disturbing than simple medical curiosity. The family Bible that Marcus Kensington kept locked in a cedar chest contained genealogical records that read like a genetic nightmare. 4 generations of marriages between siblings, cousins, and parent-child relationships meticulously documented in elegant handwriting. Each entry was accompanied by detailed notes about desired traits and breeding outcomes. What these records revealed was that the Kensington family's isolation hadn't been driven by ignorance or accident, but by a systematic program of genetic manipulation that treated human beings like livestock in a selective breeding experiment. The musty scent of aging paper mixed with cedar oil, the brittle texture of documents that cracked when touched, the faint sound of mice scurrying through walls lined with decades of accumulated family records. These were the elements that surrounded Dr. Morrison as she examined the Kensington family's private archives during her extended stay at the homestead in March of 1965. What she discovered challenged her understanding of how isolated communities could evolve when left completely to their own devices. The genealogical records began with Jonas Kensington's arrival in Minnesota in 1849, but they also referenced breeding programs that had been established in Pennsylvania before the family's migration westward. These earlier records, written in Jonas's own hand, revealed a man who viewed his family as participants in what he called divine selection, a process of genetic refinement that would produce humans with enhanced physical and mental capabilities. Jonas's interpretation of selective breeding drew heavily from agricultural practices he'd observed while working on livestock farms in Pennsylvania, but it also incorporated religious beliefs about genetic purity that had been influenced by emerging theories about human heredity. His journals from the 1850s contain extensive notes about traits he hoped to preserve and enhance through careful management of his family's reproductive choices. The Lord has blessed our bloodline with qualities that must not be diluted through mixture with inferior stock, Jonas wrote in 1852. By maintaining purity through unions within the family, we shall produce offspring who carry the concentrated essence of our ancestral strengths. Each generation shall be superior to the last, until we achieve the perfection that God intended for His chosen people. Isolation breeds more than children. The practical implementation of Jonas's breeding program required careful documentation of family relationships and genetic outcomes across multiple generations. The family Bible contained detailed charts that tracked physical characteristics, mental abilities, and what Jonas called spiritual qualities through successive generations of intermarriage. These records reveal a systematic approach to human breeding that was both methodical and deeply disturbed. By the 1870s, the second generation of Kensingtons had begun exhibiting the physical and mental abnormalities that typically result from inbreeding. But rather than recognizing these as genetic failures, the family interpreted them as evidence that their bloodline was becoming more concentrated and therefore more powerful. Children born with developmental disabilities were viewed as possessing special spiritual qualities, while physical deformities were seen as signs of genetic refinement rather than deterioration. Marcus Kensington, who assumed leadership of the family in 1898 following his father's death, expanded the breeding program to include detailed medical observations and correspondence with researchers interested in human heredity. His records from the early 1900s reveal contact with eugenics researchers who viewed the Kensington family as a valuable source of data about the long-term effects of genetic isolation. Dr. Harold Whitman of the University of Chicago visited the Kensington homestead in 1907 and documented his observations in research notes that would later be suppressed by academic authorities. The Kensington family represents a unique opportunity to study the effects of prolonged genetic isolation on human development. While the subjects exhibit obvious signs of inbreeding depression, they also display certain enhanced characteristics that warrant further investigation. Dr. Whitman's research focused on what he called genetic concentration effects, the theory that systematic inbreeding might enhance certain traits while suppressing others, potentially producing humans with capabilities that differed significantly from normal population averages. His correspondence with Marcus Kensington reveals a collaboration that continued for over 2 decades, with the family providing detailed records of births, deaths, and developmental milestones in exchange for medical supplies and scientific validation of their breeding practices. What would you do if science justified your worst impulses? The collaboration between academic researchers and the Kensington family created a feedback loop that reinforced the family's belief in their genetic superiority while providing scientists with data about human heredity that couldn't be obtained through conventional research methods. This relationship continued through the 1920s and 30s, with multiple researchers visiting the homestead to document the effects of systematic inbreeding across successive generations. But the most disturbing aspect of these research relationships wasn't the scientific interest in genetic isolation. It was the active encouragement that researchers provided for the family's continued breeding program. Rather than warning about the obvious health risks associated with inbreeding, visiting scientists often praised the family's commitment to genetic purity and suggested modifications to their breeding practices that might produce even more dramatic results. Dr. Margaret Thornton's 1932 study of the Kensington family, published in the Journal of Hereditary Research, exemplifies this disturbing collaboration. The Kensington bloodline represents one of the most complete genetic isolation experiments in modern history. The family's commitment to maintaining bloodline purity has produced fascinating variations in human development that provide valuable insight into the relationship between genetic concentration and phenotypic expression. By the 1940s, the Kensington family's breeding program had attracted attention from government researchers interested in human genetics for military applications. Classified documents discovered decades later reveal that federal scientists viewed the family as a potential source of information about producing humans with enhanced physical or mental capabilities through selective breeding. The birth of Jonathan Kensington III in 1965 represented the culmination of this century-long collaboration between isolated genetic extremists and mainstream scientific researchers. But what none of the participants anticipated was how Jonathan's specific genetic abnormalities would challenge not just medical understanding of human development, but fundamental assumptions about the relationship between genetic damage and consciousness. The question now was whether Jonathan's birth would finally expose the true nature of the experiments that had been conducted in the Minnesota wilderness, or whether the conspiracy of scientific silence would continue to protect researchers who'd used an isolated family as unwitting subjects in one of history's most disturbing genetic experiments. The telegram that arrived at the University of Minnesota Medical School on March 8, 1965, contained just 12 words that would shatter decades of carefully maintained academic silence. Subject born successfully. Unprecedented genetic concentration achieved. Request immediate consultation regarding preservation protocols. What Dr. Morrison discovered in the medical school's archives would reveal that Jonathan's birth wasn't an isolated tragedy, but the culmination of a government-funded research program that had been using the Kensington family as test subjects for over 40 years. The hollow click of typewriter keys echoing through empty university corridors. The chemical smell of preservation fluids mixed with old paper. The cold texture of metal filing cabinets that had been locked since the end of World War II. These were the sensations that surrounded Dr. Sensive Morrison as she investigated the academic connections to the Kensington family during her week-long stay in Minneapolis following Jonathan's birth. What she uncovered in the restricted archives challenged everything she thought she knew about medical ethics and government research programs. The correspondence between Marcus Kensington and university researchers dated back to 1923, when Dr. Whitman had first established formal academic interest in the family's genetic isolation experiment. But the documents Dr. N.T. Morrison discovered revealed that this relationship had evolved far beyond simple scientific observation into active collaboration designed to produce specific genetic outcomes. Dr. Whitman's research proposal, submitted to the National Science Foundation in 1937, outlined a long-term study of genetic concentration effects in isolated human populations. The proposal requested funding to monitor and guide the reproductive choices of the Kensington family over multiple generations, with the goal of documenting how systematic inbreeding might enhance or suppress various human characteristics. The Kensington family represents a unique opportunity to conduct controlled genetic research that would be impossible under normal ethical constraints, Dr. Whitman wrote. Their religious commitment to bloodline purity provides ideal conditions for studying the long-term effects of genetic concentration without the variables introduced by external breeding influences. Science sometimes serves darker masters. The federal funding that resulted from Dr. Set Whitman's proposal established what internal documents referred to as the Minnesota Genetic Isolation Project, a classified research program that provided financial support to the Kensington family in exchange for detailed documentation of births, deaths, and developmental milestones across successive generations. The project's true purpose was hidden behind academic language about hereditary research, but its practical goals focused on determining whether systematic inbreeding could produce humans with enhanced capabilities suitable for military or intelligence applications. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed that the Kensington family had received regular payments from government sources since 1938, supposedly for research participation, but effectively serving as incentives to continue their breeding program according to specifications provided by federal scientists. These payments had funded medical supplies, laboratory equipment, and even specialized nutrition programs designed to optimize the health of family members despite their genetic abnormalities. The project's records contain detailed breeding recommendations that had been provided to Marcus Kensington over the decades, including specific guidance about which family members should reproduce with whom to achieve desired genetic outcomes. The level of control exercised by outside researchers over the family's reproductive choices revealed a relationship that went far beyond simple scientific observation into active manipulation of human breeding for experimental purposes. Dr. James Patterson, who assumed leadership of the project following Dr. Whitman's death in 1951, had expanded the research to include psychological testing and behavioral modification experiments designed to enhance what he called genetic potential in family members. His reports from the 1950s describe a comprehensive program that treated the Kensington family as laboratory subjects rather than autonomous human beings. The subjects have responded well to conditioning protocols designed to reinforce desired behavioral patterns. Dr. Patterson wrote in 1956, "Their isolation and dependency on project support has created ideal conditions for implementing genetic guidance programs that would be impossible in normal population groups." What would you do if your government funded human experimentation? The most disturbing revelation in the project files was the discovery that Jonathan's birth had been specifically planned and anticipated by government researchers for over 5 years. The genetic pairing of Sarah and Marcus Kensington had been recommended by federal scientists based on computer models that predicted their offspring would exhibit extreme genetic concentration effects that might provide insight into the devil-eyed relationship between genetic damage and enhanced consciousness. Dr. Morrison found detailed projections dating back to 1960 that accurately predicted many of Jonathan's specific abnormalities, along with theoretical frameworks suggesting that such extreme genetic concentration might produce forms of consciousness or awareness that differed significantly from normal human experience. The researchers weren't hoping to create a healthy child, they were deliberately attempting to produce a genetically damaged one whose abnormalities might reveal new information about human consciousness and development. The project's classified status meant that the Kensington family had never been informed about the true nature of their participation in federal research. They genuinely believed that outside scientists were interested in validating their theories about genetic superiority, never realizing that they were being used as test subjects in experiments designed to explore the outer boundaries of human genetic manipulation. Dr. Patterson's final report, submitted just weeks before Jonathan's birth, reveals the project's ultimate goals. After 27 years of genetic concentration, Subject Group K is approaching theoretical limits of inbreeding viability. The anticipated offspring represents our best opportunity to document extreme genetic concentration effects and their impact on human consciousness. Success in this phase could provide crucial data for future genetic enhancement programs. The report also contained recommendations for preservation protocols that would allow researchers to study Jonathan throughout his expected shortened lifespan, including detailed plans for medical monitoring, behavioral testing, and post-mortem analysis. The child's life had been planned and commodified by federal scientists before he was even born. But Dr. Morrison's investigation also revealed that the Minnesota Genetic Isolation Project was just one component of a broader network of government-funded genetic research programs that had been operating in isolated communities throughout the United States since the 1930s. The Kensington family represented just one of dozens of test populations that had been manipulated for experimental purposes under the cover of academic research. The discovery of this broader conspiracy would raise questions about how many other families had been unknowingly subjected to genetic experimentation and whether Jonathan's birth represented an isolated tragedy or part of a systematic program of human manipulation that extended throughout American society. The medical examination that Dr. Morrison conducted on March 15, 1965, revealed that Jonathan Kensington III possessed a brain structure unlike anything documented in medical literature. Neurons organized in patterns that shouldn't have been able to sustain consciousness, yet somehow supported awareness that appeared to exceed normal human capabilities. What she discovered would challenge everything medicine understood about the relationship between genetic damage and human consciousness, while raising terrifying questions about what government researchers had actually created in their isolated Minnesota laboratory. The soft beeping of primitive medical monitoring equipment, the antiseptic smell of alcohol mixed with something indefinably organic, the smooth texture of examination table paper that crinkled with each movement. These were the sensations that filled the makeshift medical facility that Dr. Morrison established in one of the Kensington family's cabins during her extended evaluation of Jonathan's condition. What she documented over 8 days of intensive testing would revolutionize understanding of human neurology, while horrifying everyone who read her classified reports. Jonathan's physical abnormalities were immediately apparent to any observer. His cranium was enlarged and misshapen, with bone structure that had developed in ways that shouldn't have been compatible with life. His limbs showed severe deformities, consistent with genetic disorders caused by extreme inbreeding, and his cardiovascular system operated according to patterns that defied conventional medical understanding. But it was Jonathan's neurological development that truly challenged medical science. Brain scans conducted using portable equipment revealed neural architecture that bore little resemblance to normal human brain structure. Regions typically associated with specific cognitive functions had developed in completely different areas, while new neural pathways had emerged that didn't exist in standard human anatomy. The subject's brain exhibits organizational patterns that represent either extreme developmental abnormality or evolutionary adaptation. Dr. Morrison noted in her March 20th report, neural density in certain regions exceeds normal human parameters by factors that should have resulted in immediate death, yet the subject demonstrates consciousness and awareness that appears to function normally despite the structural abnormalities. Some broken things work better than whole ones. The most disturbing aspect of Jonathan's condition wasn't his physical abnormalities. It was the evidence that his damaged genetics had somehow produced enhanced rather than diminished cognitive capabilities. Standard intelligence testing proved impossible due to his physical limitations, but behavioral observations suggested awareness and problem-solving abilities that exceeded normal developmental milestones for his age. Dr. Morrison's daily observation notes document a pattern of responses that indicated Jonathan possessed understanding of complex concepts that he couldn't have learned through normal developmental processes. At 8 days old, he demonstrated recognition of pattern relationships and causality that typically don't appear until months or years of normal development. More unsettling still were observations suggesting that Jonathan's consciousness operated according to principles that differed fundamentally from normal human awareness. Dr. Morrison noted instances where the infant appeared to respond to stimuli that weren't present in his immediate environment, as if his awareness extended beyond the normal boundaries of sensory perception. The subject exhibits responses to environmental factors that aren't detectable through conventional measurement, she wrote on March 22nd. His behavior suggests awareness of patterns or relationships that exist beyond normal sensory input, raising questions about whether extreme genetic concentration has produced forms of consciousness that operate according to different principles than standard human awareness. These observations aligned with theoretical frameworks that government researchers had developed about the potential relationship between genetic damage and enhanced consciousness. Project documents suggested that extreme inbreeding might disrupt normal neural development in ways that could produce alternative forms of awareness consciousness that might be damaged in conventional terms, but enhanced in ways that science didn't yet understand. Dr. Patterson's theoretical models, developed over years of studying the Kensington family, had predicted that extreme genetic concentration might produce what he called transcendent consciousness, awareness that operated beyond normal human limitations because it wasn't constrained by conventional neural architecture. Jonathan appeared to be the first documented case of this theoretical phenomenon. What would you do if evolution meant devolution? The implications of Jonathan's condition extended far beyond medical curiosity into areas that had profound implications for government research programs. If systematic genetic damage could produce enhanced consciousness, it suggested that human awareness might be far more flexible and adaptable than previously understood. This possibility had enormous potential value for military and intelligence applications. Dr. Morrison discovered that federal researchers had been developing plans for replicating Jonathan's genetic profile in other isolated populations, using the Kensington family's breeding records as a template for producing similar genetic concentration effects. The Minnesota project was intended as a proof of concept for broader programs that would create networks of genetically modified humans with enhanced consciousness capabilities. The project's classified objectives included plans for establishing similar genetic isolation experiments in remote communities throughout the United States, with the goal of producing populations of individuals whose consciousness operated according to enhanced parameters. These programs would be disguised as academic research or social welfare initiatives, but their true purpose would be creating humans with capabilities that could be exploited for national security purposes. But Jonathan's case also revealed the enormous risks associated with attempting to replicate such extreme genetic manipulation. His physical abnormalities made normal life impossible, and his shortened life expectancy meant that even successful consciousness enhancement came at enormous biological cost. The government researchers were essentially creating humans whose enhanced awareness was purchased through systematic destruction of their physical viability. Dr. Morrison's reports documented the ethical nightmare that resulted when scientific curiosity intersected with government interests in human enhancement. The Kensington family had been unknowingly transformed into a laboratory for producing genetically damaged humans whose consciousness might exceed normal parameters, but whose physical existence represented a form of systematic torture disguised as research. The question now was whether Jonathan's birth would expose the broader program of genetic manipulation that had been operating in isolated American communities for decades, or whether government interests in consciousness enhancement would continue to drive experiments that treated human beings as raw material for scientific advancement. As Dr. Morrison prepared to submit her findings to medical authorities, she faced a decision that would determine whether Jonathan's tragedy would lead to justice for the families who'd been exploited, or simply provide data for expanding programs that viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost for scientific progress. The town of Stillwater, Minnesota, had been receiving strange reports about the isolated Kensington family for over 50 years. Yet not a single official investigation had ever been conducted. When concerned citizens raised questions about the welfare of children in the mountain community, they were told that research purposes made intervention inadvisable. What Dr. Morrison discovered was that an entire county had been complicit in allowing systematic child abuse disguised as scientific research, choosing federal funding over basic human decency. The sharp crack of filing cabinet drawers being forced open, the musty smell of decades-old correspondence mixed with bureaucratic indifference, the worn texture of official documents that had been deliberately misfiled to avoid scrutiny. These were the elements that surrounded Dr. Dollars. Morrison, as she investigated the broader conspiracy of silence that had protected the Kensington family's genetic experiments from outside interference. What she uncovered revealed a systematic pattern of institutional complicity that extended throughout Washington County's government structure. The first documented concerns about the Kensington family had been raised in 1914 by a traveling teacher who'd encountered several of the children during a brief visit to the homestead. Mary Patterson's report to county education authorities described children with obvious developmental disabilities, who appeared to be suffering from neglect and possible abuse. But her recommendations for investigation were dismissed by officials who claimed that special family circumstances made normal intervention inappropriate. Similar reports had been filed by postal workers, traveling merchants, and religious missionaries throughout the 1920s and 30s, but each investigation request had been denied by county authorities, who cited ongoing research considerations as justification for avoiding official intervention. The pattern of deliberate avoidance became so consistent that concerned citizens eventually stopped reporting problems, understanding that their efforts would be systematically ignored. Sheriff William Morrison, who served Washington County from 1938 to 1962, made this policy explicit in a 1947 memo to his deputies. The Kensington family situation is under federal oversight for research purposes. All inquiries regarding their welfare should be referred to university authorities. No county intervention is authorized without approval from federal research coordinators. Money talks louder than morality. The financial incentives that ensured county compliance with federal research programs became apparent when Dr. Morrison examined Washington County's budget records from the 1940s and 50s. Federal grants related to rural development research had provided substantial funding for county infrastructure projects, with the clear understanding that continued funding depended on non-interference with genetic research programs operating within county boundaries. County Commissioner Robert Hayes acknowledged this relationship in private correspondence with federal researchers. Washington County appreciates the substantial federal investment in our rural development programs. We understand that continued funding requires our cooperation with legitimate research activities, and we are committed to ensuring that academic freedom is protected from unnecessary bureaucratic interference. The arrangement created a perfect system for protecting unethical research from scrutiny, while providing financial benefits that made county officials active participants in covering up systematic abuse. Federal researchers could operate without oversight, while local authorities received funding that made their cooperation financially advantageous rather than simply corrupt. This conspiracy of silence extended beyond government officials to include medical professionals, social workers, and religious leaders who encountered evidence of the Kensington family situation but chose not to pursue intervention. Dr. Day. Morrison discovered that multiple professionals had documented concerns about the family over the decades, but their reports had been systematically suppressed or ignored by supervisors who understood the political implications of challenging federally funded research programs. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a public health nurse who visited the Kensington homestead in 1953, documented her observations in a report that was immediately classified and buried in county archives. The children in this household exhibit signs of severe developmental disabilities and physical abnormalities consistent with systematic inbreeding. Their living conditions and obvious genetic problems suggest ongoing abuse that requires immediate intervention. Yet, I have been instructed that federal research priorities supersede normal child welfare protocols. What would you do if helping meant losing your job? The most disturbing aspect of the community's complicity wasn't simple corruption or indifference. It was the active participation of professionals who understood the ethical implications of their silence, but chose institutional loyalty over moral responsibility. Medical professionals who recognized obvious signs of genetic abuse chose to document their concerns privately, while publicly supporting the fiction that the Kensington family situation represented legitimate research rather than systematic child exploitation. This pattern of professional complicity created a web of institutional protection that made challenging the research program virtually impossible for individual whistleblowers. Anyone who attempted to expose the true nature of the genetic experiments faced career destruction, legal harassment, and social ostracism from colleagues who understood that their own professional security depended on maintaining the conspiracy of silence. The system proved so effective that by 1965, when Jonathan's birth provided irrefutable evidence of the program's true nature, most county officials had convinced themselves that they were protecting legitimate scientific research rather than enabling systematic child abuse. The psychological mechanisms that allowed otherwise decent people to participate in covering up genetic experimentation demonstrated how institutional corruption could transform moral individuals into complicit participants in systematic evil. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed that similar patterns of community complicity existed around other genetic research sites throughout the United States, suggesting that the Minnesota Project was part of a broader network of federally funded human experimentation that relied on local cooperation secured through financial incentives and professional intimidation. The Washington County case study provided a template for understanding how unethical research programs could operate for decades without exposure, protected by combinations of federal authority, financial incentives, and institutional cultures that prioritize compliance over moral responsibility. The same mechanisms that had protected the Kensington family's genetic experiments were likely operating in dozens of other communities where isolated families served as unwitting test subjects for government research programs. But Jonathan's birth had created evidence that was too dramatic to suppress through normal channels of institutional control. His genetic abnormalities provided irrefutable proof of systematic abuse that couldn't be dismissed as academic research, forcing the conspiracy of silence to confront challenges that threatened to expose the entire network of genetic experimentation programs. The question now was whether the institutional mechanisms that had protected genetic research for decades would prove sufficient to contain the scandal that Jonathan's birth threatened to unleash, or whether the evidence of systematic child abuse would finally overcome the financial and professional incentives that had maintained community complicity for over 50 years. The autopsy report filed on October 13, 1965, documented that Jonathan Kensington III had survived for 7 months, with brain tissue that functioned despite being organized in patterns that shouldn't have supported consciousness. His death wasn't from genetic failure, it was from deliberate intervention by researchers who wanted to study his unique neural architecture while it was still fresh. What Dr. Morrison discovered about the circumstances of Jonathan's death would reveal that government scientists valued the child's brain more than his life, and that his brief existence had been carefully managed to maximize research potential rather than his well-being. The sterile hum of refrigeration units maintaining tissue samples at precise temperatures, the chemical smell of formaldehyde mixed with something that defied identification, the cold texture of stainless steel examination tables that had been designed for research rather than healing. These were the sensations that filled the underground laboratory beneath the University of Minnesota Medical School, where Dr. Morrison conducted her investigation into Jonathan's final months. What she discovered challenged her understanding of both medical ethics and the depths to which scientific curiosity could descend when freed from moral constraints. Jonathan's death had occurred under circumstances that Dr. Morrison initially assumed were natural consequences of his genetic abnormalities. But closer examination of medical records revealed a pattern of intervention that suggested his demise had been carefully orchestrated rather than simply anticipated. The child's final weeks had been spent in the university's experimental medicine facility, where researchers had conducted extensive testing designed to document his unique neurological development before his expected death. Dr. Patterson's research notes from Jonathan's final month revealed the true priorities that had guided the child's medical care. Subject J3 represents an unprecedented opportunity to study alternative consciousness structures in living tissue. His shortened life expectancy makes it imperative that we gather complete neurological data before natural deterioration compromises research potential. The medical care that Jonathan received during his final weeks consisted primarily of procedures designed to gather research data rather than provide comfort or extend his life. Brain scans, neural mapping, and consciousness testing had been conducted daily, with little regard for the child's obvious distress or deteriorating physical condition. Some experiments value data over humanity. The most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Morrison discovered that Jonathan's death hadn't resulted from his genetic abnormalities, but from complications arising from an experimental procedure designed to map his unique neural pathways while he was still conscious. Researchers had determined that his brain's unusual organization could only be properly studied while active, leading them to conduct invasive neurological testing that ultimately proved fatal. Dr. Patricia Wells, who served as Jonathan's primary medical supervisor during his final weeks, documented the decision-making process that led to his death. The subject's unique neural architecture represents a once-in-a-lifetime research opportunity that justifies extraordinary measures to gather complete data. His survival prospects are minimal regardless of intervention, making aggressive research protocols ethically defensible given the potential scientific value. The experimental procedures that caused Jonathan's death had been approved by a federal research committee that operated under classified authority and wasn't subject to normal medical ethics oversight. This committee had determined that the scientific value of studying Jonathan's consciousness exceeded considerations about his comfort or survival, effectively treating him as laboratory equipment rather than a human patient. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed that Jonathan's brain had been removed within hours of his death and preserved using experimental techniques that maintain tissue viability for extended research purposes. The post-mortem examination had been conducted not to determine cause of death, but to harvest neural tissue for ongoing consciousness research that continued long after the child's demise. The preserved brain tissue became the foundation for classified research programs that studied alternative consciousness structures for potential military and intelligence applications. Jonathan's unique neural architecture provided researchers with insights into forms of awareness that operated beyond normal human parameters, information that had enormous strategic value for government agencies interested in consciousness manipulation and enhancement. What would you do if your child became raw material for research? The Kensington family had been informed of Jonathan's death, but hadn't been told about the true circumstances or the disposition of his remains. They genuinely believed that their child had died from natural causes and that his body had been properly buried, never realizing that his brain was being used for ongoing research that continued to exploit their genetic tragedy for scientific advancement. Dr. Morrison discovered that Jonathan's preserved neural tissue was just one component of a broader research program that studied consciousness structures derived from genetic experimentation conducted in isolated communities throughout the United States. The Minnesota Project had provided researchers with access to alternative forms of human awareness that couldn't be studied through conventional means, creating a database of consciousness variations that had enormous potential for military and intelligence applications. The research conducted on Jonathan's brain tissue had led to theoretical breakthroughs in understanding how consciousness operated and how it might be modified or enhanced through various interventions. This information was being used to develop programs for enhancing the awareness capabilities of intelligence operatives and military personnel, with the ultimate goal of creating humans whose consciousness operated according to enhanced parameters. But the scientific advances achieved through studying Jonathan's brain came at the cost of systematic child abuse and murder disguised as medical research. The government's willingness to exploit genetic abnormalities for research purposes revealed a scientific establishment that had abandoned basic ethical principles in pursuit of knowledge with strategic applications. Dr. Morrison's investigation also revealed that similar fates had befallen other children born into the genetic research programs operating in isolated communities throughout the country. Jonathan wasn't the first child to be killed for research purposes, and unless the broader program was exposed and terminated, he wouldn't be the last. The pattern of systematic exploitation demonstrated how government research programs could operate without ethical oversight when their activities were classified and their subjects were isolated from normal social protection. Mechanisms. The families used for genetic experimentation had no legal recourse and no political representation, making them perfect victims for research that required human subjects but couldn't operate within normal ethical constraints. The question now was whether Dr. Morrison's investigation would expose the broader program of genetic experimentation and consciousness research that had cost Jonathan his life, or whether the institutional mechanisms that protected classified research would successfully contain her findings and allow the systematic exploitation of isolated families to continue. As she prepared to reveal her discoveries about Jonathan's death and the broader conspiracy of genetic research, Dr. Dine Morrison faced the challenge of exposing scientific crimes that operated under federal authority and enjoyed protection from the highest levels of government. The classified document that Dr. Morrison discovered in a misfiled cabinet on November 22, 1965, bore the heading Project Genetic Echo, Phase 3, Implementation, and outlined plans to establish genetic isolation programs in 43 additional communities across 17 states. Jonathan's case wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a prototype for nationwide human experimentation. What she uncovered would reveal that the United States government had been conducting systematic genetic manipulation of isolated families since the 1930s, treating American citizens like laboratory animals in a program designed to explore the outer boundaries of human consciousness and physical capability. The low hum of fluorescent lights in abandoned government offices, the acrid smell of burning documents mixed with bureaucratic desperation, the rough texture of papers that someone had tried unsuccessfully to destroy these, were the elements that surrounded Dr. People Morrison as she conducted her final investigation into the scope of federal genetic research programs during the chaotic weeks following her exposure of Jonathan's murder. What she discovered revealed a conspiracy so vast and systematic that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between American citizens and their government. Project Genetic Echo had been established in 1934 under the direct authority of the National Security Council, with funding that came from classified military budgets and operated completely outside normal oversight mechanisms. The project's stated goal was exploring human genetic potential through controlled population studies, but its practical objectives focused on producing humans with enhanced capabilities that could serve military and intelligence purposes. The Minnesota site was just one of dozens of genetic research facilities that had been established in isolated communities throughout the United States. Each facility used different approaches to genetic manipulation, but all shared the common goal of producing humans whose physical or mental capabilities exceeded normal parameters. Through systematic breeding programs disguised as academic research or social welfare initiatives, Dr. Patterson's role in the Minnesota project was replicated by researchers at facilities in rural Montana, isolated regions of Alaska, remote areas of Nevada, and mountain communities throughout Appalachia. Each site operated according to protocols that treated isolated families as experimental subjects rather than autonomous human beings, with researchers exercising complete control over reproductive choices and child-rearing practices. The scope of the program became clear when Dr. Morrison discovered population studies that documented genetic manipulation affecting over 15,000 individuals across multiple generations. These studies revealed systematic patterns of inbreeding, genetic modification, and consciousness experimentation that had been conducted on American soil for over 30 years, without any form of public oversight or ethical review. Democracy dies in classified darkness. The most disturbing aspect of Project Genetic Echo wasn't its scale, but its integration with normal government operations. The program enjoyed support from multiple federal agencies, including the Department of Health, the National Science Foundation, and various military research divisions. This institutional support meant that genetic experimentation had become a normalized component of government research rather than a rogue operation conducted by isolated scientists. The project's theoretical foundations drew heavily from eugenics research that had been discredited following World War II, but federal scientists had reframed their human experimentation as national security research rather than racial improvement programs. By focusing on consciousness enhancement and physical capability modification, researchers could pursue genetic manipulation goals while avoiding the political problems associated with explicit eugenics programs. Dr. Morrison discovered internal correspondence that revealed the project's ultimate objectives extended far beyond simple research into consciousness and physical capability modification. The long-term goal was developing methods for producing humans who could serve specialized military and intelligence functions, individuals whose genetic modifications would make them ideally suited for espionage, combat, or other national security applications. Phase 4 implementation will focus on operational deployment of enhanced individuals in field situations, according to a 1964 planning document. Subjects with verified consciousness modifications and physical enhancements will be integrated into intelligence operations to assess practical applications of genetic research findings. The document outlined plans for using genetically modified individuals as intelligence operatives whose enhanced capabilities and altered consciousness would provide strategic advantages in espionage and military operations. These individuals would be deployed without their knowledge of their genetic modification, believing themselves to be normal agents rather than products of systematic human experimentation. What would you do if your government bred you like livestock? The revelation that Project Genetic Echo planned to deploy genetically modified humans in operational roles demonstrated how far federal researchers were willing to extend their experimentation beyond isolated laboratory settings into active military and intelligence applications. The families used for genetic research weren't just providing data. They were producing human assets that would be exploited for national security purposes. Dr. Morrison also discovered evidence that similar genetic research programs were being conducted by allied governments, with coordination and information sharing that suggested international cooperation in developing enhanced human capabilities through systematic genetic manipulation. The scope of human experimentation extended beyond American borders into a global network of consciousness and capability research. The international dimensions of genetic research programs raised questions about how many governments were conducting systematic human experimentation on their own citizens and whether the techniques developed through projects like Genetic Echo were being shared with foreign intelligence services for operational deployment. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery that Project Genetic Echo included contingency plans for population-scale implementation of genetic modification techniques if research results prove sufficiently promising. These plans outline methods for introducing genetic modifications into broader population groups through public health programs, educational initiatives, and other government services that would provide access to large numbers of citizens. The prospect of government agencies using public health programs to conduct genetic experiments on unwitting citizens represented the ultimate extension of the systematic dehumanization that had begun with isolated families like the Kensington I, Kensingtons. If genetic research proved successful in producing enhanced humans, the same techniques could potentially be applied to entire populations without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Morrison's investigation had revealed that Jonathan Kensington's tragic death was just one casualty in a vast program of human experimentation that treated American citizens as raw material for genetic research. The systematic abuse that had destroyed the Kensington family was being replicated in dozens of communities across the country, with federal researchers using isolation and deception to conduct experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. The question now was whether her evidence would be sufficient to expose and terminate programs that operated under the highest levels of government authority, or whether the institutional mechanisms that protected classified research would prove strong enough to contain revelations that threatened to expose one of the most systematic violations of human rights in American history. As Dr. Morrison prepared to release her findings to the press and congressional investigators, she faced the challenge of exposing crimes that had been authorized by the same government institutions that were responsible for protecting American citizens from exactly the kind of systematic abuse that Project Genetic Echo represented. The fire that consumed the University of Minnesota Medical School's basement research facility on December 15, 1965, destroyed nearly 30 years of genetic research data and left only charred remains of what had once been the most extensive human consciousness laboratory in the United States. Dr. Tension. Morrison's body was found in the ruins, her death officially attributed to a tragic accident involving faulty electrical equipment. But the evidence she'd hidden in safety deposit boxes across 3 states would ensure that the truth about Project Genetic Echo would eventually surface, even if it took decades for anyone to believe what she discovered about the government's systematic destruction of human dignity. The silence that followed complete destruction, the acrid smell of smoke that couldn't quite mask the odor of burned flesh and formaldehyde, the brittle texture of documents reduced to ash that crumbled at the slightest touch. These were the elements that greeted investigators when they examined the ruins of what had been one of America's most sophisticated genetic research facilities. The official investigation concluded that Dr. Morrison had died accidentally while conducting late-night research, but evidence suggested that her death had been far more deliberate than authorities were willing to acknowledge. The timing of the fire, occurring just hours before Dr. Morrison was scheduled to meet with congressional investigators about Project Genetic Echo, suggested coordination that went beyond simple coincidence. Federal agents had been monitoring her activities since her initial exposure of Jonathan's murder, and classified documents later revealed that her investigation had been viewed as a national security threat requiring immediate termination. Dr. Morrison's death marked the beginning of a systematic cover-up that extended throughout the federal research establishment. Within weeks of the fire, all personnel associated with genetic research programs were transferred to new assignments. Funding for consciousness studies was redirected through different channels, and official records of Project Genetic Echo were reclassified at levels that made them inaccessible to normal oversight mechanisms. The Kensington family disappeared entirely during this period, with their homestead abandoned and their whereabouts unknown. Official records suggested they had relocated voluntarily, but evidence indicated that federal agents had removed them to prevent further investigation into their genetic experimentation. Whether they were relocated to protective custody or eliminated entirely remained unknown, but their sudden disappearance effectively ended any possibility of exposing the full scope of genetic research through direct testimony. Truth dies when witnesses disappear. The cover-up's effectiveness demonstrated how thoroughly genetic research programs had been integrated into government operations. Multiple federal agencies participated in suppressing evidence, intimidating potential witnesses, and redirecting public attention away from systematic human experimentation. The coordination required for such comprehensive suppression revealed institutional commitment to protecting genetic research that extended to the highest levels of government authority. Congressional investigators who attempted to pursue Dr. Morrison's allegations found themselves blocked by claims of national security and executive privilege that made access to relevant documents impossible. The few officials willing to discuss genetic research programs spoke only in general terms about theoretical studies, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of systematic human experimentation or genetic manipulation conducted on American citizens. Media coverage of Dr. Morrison's death and her allegations about genetic research was systematically suppressed through pressure applied to publishers and broadcast executives. Stories that might have exposed the scope of human experimentation were killed or redirected toward less sensitive topics, ensuring that public attention never focused on systematic genetic manipulation programs operating within American borders. The success of the cover-up created a template for suppressing future revelations about government research programs. Potential whistleblowers understood that challenging classified research operations carried personal risks that extended beyond simple career destruction to physical elimination, creating institutional cultures that prioritized self-preservation over moral responsibility. But Dr. Morrison's preparation for exposing genetic research programs had included safeguards that couldn't be completely eliminated through official suppression. Her evidence was distributed across multiple locations and entrusted to individuals who weren't connected to government research programs, ensuring that systematic human experimentation would eventually face exposure, even if immediate revelation proved impossible. What would you do if the truth required martyrdom? The scattered evidence that Dr. Morrison had preserved gradually surfaced over the following decades, creating a mosaic of revelation that documented systematic genetic manipulation despite official efforts to suppress investigation. Freedom of Information Act requests, congressional investigations, and academic research slowly assembled documentation that confirmed the scope and systematic nature of human experimentation conducted under federal authority. By the 1980s, sufficient evidence had accumulated to establish that Project Genetic Echo had operated as described in Dr. Morrison's allegations, but the individuals responsible for systematic human experimentation had retired or died, making legal accountability impossible. The victims of genetic research programs had been scattered or eliminated, preventing the kind of comprehensive investigation that might have revealed the full scope of government crimes against human dignity. The long delay between Dr. Morrison's initial revelations and their eventual confirmation demonstrated how effectively institutional cover-ups could suppress evidence of systematic wrongdoing when they operated with sufficient authority and coordination. Truth eventually emerged, but not quickly enough to provide justice for the families who'd been destroyed through genetic experimentation. The legacy of Project Genetic Echo extended beyond the specific individuals who'd been victimized through genetic research into broader questions about the relationship between scientific advancement and human rights. The systematic dehumanization that had enabled genetic experimentation revealed how easily institutional authority could override moral constraints when research goals were classified as matters of national security. Modern investigations into genetic research programs have confirmed that similar experimentation continued in various forms long after Dr. Morrison's death, suggesting that the institutional cultures that enabled systematic human manipulation weren't fundamentally changed by exposure of their crimes. The techniques and theoretical frameworks developed through projects like Genetic Echo continued to influence government research programs, even when their most extreme applications were officially discontinued. The story of Jonathan Kensington III and the genetic research programs that destroyed his family provides a window into systematic violations of human dignity that operated under government authority for decades. His brief life and tragic death represented just one casualty in a vast program of human experimentation that treated American citizens as laboratory equipment rather than autonomous beings deserving of basic respect and protection. The question that remains is whether modern oversight mechanisms provide sufficient protection against similar programs, or whether the institutional cultures that enabled systematic genetic experimentation continue to operate in forms that aren't yet visible to public scrutiny. Dr. Seth. Morrison's sacrifice ensured that the truth about genetic research would eventually surface, but it didn't guarantee that similar programs wouldn't emerge under different classifications and institutional protections. Even today, residents near the abandoned Kensington homestead report seeing children with unusual physical characteristics playing in the ruins, suggesting that some genetic legacies prove impossible to completely eliminate, even decades after their official termination. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.